Well, good morning. Good to see everybody today. Do you have a Bible this morning? I need you to open with me, if you will, in your New Testament to the book of Luke, chapter 12. We're going to the 12th division of the Gospel of Luke this morning, and we'll spend all of our time right there, Luke chapter 12. And along with the sentiment expressed already this morning, if you're visiting with us today in our church family, we are so happy that you are here. I look in this audience today and see lots of new faces that are with us, and I know that many of you are here because you accepted an invitation from one of our members, and we welcome you. We hope you feel very much at home among us today, very comfortable here, and we hope that you'll come and be with us again. We would encourage you this morning. Should have been a bulletin that we call a family report that was given to you this morning. On the back page is a place that you can jot a few notes as we go through what we want to consider. That will help you a bit this morning, I think. And we hope that you will enjoy being with us today. We hope you'll come back and be with us again. We'll meet this afternoon at 5 o'clock again and have a very similar kind of service this afternoon at 5. We're going to talk a little bit about peace for anxious days and peace for anxious nights. There's a passage in the New Testament that deals with how to have that in a very powerful way, and we'll talk about that, the Lord willing, tonight at 5. We'd love to have you with us then. So good to see all of you today. I'm glad to be home today, back where I belong, and glad to get to be with you. 3 weeks ago, I read a story that I want to share with you very quickly because it makes a point about where we're going this morning. It's a story about a government worker, and he was sitting in his office, and he really wasn't accomplishing very much at all. He was just stacking paper clips and shuffling papers, and he reached into his desk, and his hand hit an object that he had not felt before, and he pulled it out, and it was a bottle. Well, he opened the bottle, and wouldn't you know, a genie came out. So now you know where this story is going, right? And so the genie said, "I will give you any 3 wishes." Well, he didn't believe that, and so he said, "All right." He said, "I'd like to have a Diet Coke from McDonald's." And poof, there it was in his hand. And he thought, wow, maybe I should take this a little more seriously. So he thought for a minute for his second wish, and he said, "All right, here's what I want. I would like to be on a beautiful beach in Hawaii." And poof, he was on a beach in Maui. And he thought, wow, this is amazing. The genie said, "Now be very careful, you only have 1 wish remaining." So he thought, wow, what should I ask for? And he thought, I got it. So he said, "Here's what I want. I want to never have to work another day in my life." And poof, he was back in his government office again. So now if you work for the government, I did not write that. And I humbly apologize. But it makes the point that we should be very careful about what we ask for. And we should be careful about what we want for our future. And we see that very clearly in this passage in Luke chapter 12. Would you read it with me, please? Luke 12. I want you to read with me beginning in verse 13. Now, the passage begins by saying there's a great multitude of people that Jesus is talking to. And in the middle of that, verse 13 says that one from the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But Jesus said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or an arbiter over you?" And he said to him, "Take heed and beware of covetousness. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things that he possesses." Well, then Jesus spoke a parable to them, saying, "The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, 'What am I going to do? I have no room now to store my crops.' And so he said, 'I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I'll store all of my crops and all my goods. And I'll say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. So take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this night your soul will be required of you. And then whose will those things be which you provided?'" And here's the application. "So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." Let's stop there for just a second. This is a very famous parable. Jesus told a lot of parables, some 38, but some are more well known than others. This one is typically very well known. It's a story where it's very easy to see the flaw in the main character, sometimes not so easy to see in ourselves. Now, Jesus never told random stories. He told his parables almost always for a particular purpose and to make a particular point. The springboard for this story was what we read in verse 13. That someone in the crowd interrupted his teaching and said, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And so this man obviously was in a family fight, a family feud about inheritances and about money. And so that's where this began. Now, the odd thing about that is that Jesus had been talking about serious matters, really deep matters, important matters. He hadn't said anything about family or finances or inheritance, and so this man interrupted him and just wanted to talk about what he wanted to talk about. He wasn't listening to what Jesus was talking about at all. Have you ever gotten in trouble because you didn't listen to what you should listen to? That happened to me a lot, particularly when I was younger. But it's probably happened to all of us, where we didn't listen to a mom and dad, or we didn't listen to our grandparents, or maybe we didn't listen to somebody that we considered highly and esteemed highly, or we just didn't listen to God, or we didn't listen to God's Son, Jesus. Well, Jesus didn't solve this sibling rivalry. He doesn't get involved in that. But he does speak to the issue, and he uses that question or that demand as a springboard to talk about focus and priority and future. You know, it's interesting when I read that story. There were a lot of good things about this farmer. We don't ever talk about that. We usually talk about the bad things, but there were a lot of good things about this farmer. He was skilled at what he did. He wasn't lazy. He planned for the future, and he was prosperous. There is no hint of dishonesty in this man. He is not indicted for stealing. He's not indicted for fixing prices. He wasn't even trying to buy his kid's way into an Ivy League college. And so he's a pretty good man. But if he understood anything about his connection with God as a farmer, he didn't say anything about it. He certainly didn't acknowledge that. But farmers and God are forever intertwined. I mean, it's God who created the fertile soil. It's God who controls the sun and the rain. It's God who put life in a seed. But this man doesn't thank God. He doesn't include God. He doesn't think about God. But I want you to notice God was thinking about him. Did you notice that? He gives no thought at all to God, but God is thinking about him. And so in the story, in the aftermath of one particularly profitable season, the farmer decides to take his ease. Now, I got to tell you, I know a lot of farmers throughout the United States, and taking your ease is not in their vocabulary. They work hard. And in fact, most of them work hard their whole life. The idea of saying, I'm gonna take my ease for years to come, that just never enters usually a farmer's mind. They're hard workers. But this one crop changed this man's life. Nothing wrong with retiring, and he had the wherewithal now to do that. Usually when this story is told, there's a lot of emphasis on the fact that he tore down his barns and built greater. Well, I've talked about that a lot. There wasn't anything wrong with that. We have all done that. We've all torn down our barns and built greater. I was talking to one of our members here this morning who have a newly married child, and I said, how the newlyweds doing? And they said, well, they're trying to get settled. They bought some old furniture this weekend, and they're painting it and trying to we all did that. But you know what? As time goes on, life gets better for us, and we tear down our barns and build greater with our cars or with our clothes or with our houses or whatever it may be. Nothing wrong with that. The issue here isn't barns. The issue is hearts. And so the conclusion was, so is the one, that is, you are a fool, God said, so is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Again, nothing wrong with prospering. Solomon said, Ecclesiastes 7:14, in the day of prosperity rejoice. Well, that's a thing about which we should rejoice. But the key in this verse is that little conjunction, and. So is he who lays up treasure for himself. Nothing wrong with that. But this problem was he was not rich toward God. Verse 20 in the story is telling. God said to him, you fool. This very night your life will be demanded from you, and then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This very night, not this year, not this month, not this week, but this very night. Well, that was important because this man had no thought about that. He thought time was certain and secure. It just was not. He thought it was time to sit back and relax. It wasn't. He thought he had years and years and years ahead of him, but he didn't. He woke up in eternity, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't in charge. He wasn't in control of his life. And now God says you don't have any time to change. You don't have any time to make amends. You don't have any time to get your affairs in order or settle your estate. He planned on living, but the point of the story is that he never planned on dying. And so there was nothing in his God account. Spiritually, the man was just as bankrupt as he could be. And so God didn't cross his radar, didn't enter his plans, didn't affect his life, didn't control his heart. Now, God said in this verse, you fool. You can search your Bible, ladies and gentlemen. That's the strongest word that God ever uses in indicting someone, is to call them a fool. The psalmist said in Psalm 14:1 that the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And so God looks at a man who lives as a practical atheist and says, you're foolish for doing that. Why did God call him a fool? Because he was one. He lived as though God didn't exist and his future was in his control. But in the heart of that story, and what we really want to talk about this morning is that the man says, I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Have you ever talked to your soul? Now, we talk to ourselves all the time. We tell ourselves things. We have conversations with ourselves. But this man said, I'm going to talk to my soul. And I want to ask you, have you ever done that? Have you ever had a conversation with your soul? And what I'm going to suggest to you this morning is that we would all do well to do that from time to time. To have a little conversation with our soul about our soul. An honest, no-holds-barred talk with ourselves. And so I want to ask you this morning, what should we make sure that our soul understands? Well, if you're taking notes on the back of that family report, let me tell you 3 things that we need to make sure that our soul understands. 3 things very quickly. Here they are. Number one, that life is more than possessions. Now, Jesus said that in verse 15. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of the things that he happens to possess. And in fact, he will go on later in the narrative that we did not read down in verse 22. And when he explains the parable, he said to his disciples, therefore, I say to you, don't worry about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. Life is more than food, and the body is more than just clothing. Well, let's think about that. How would we put that in 21st century terms? If we were to take that out of the first century in which Jesus lived and bring it into the world in which we live, how might we phrase that? Well, maybe the contrary to our culture, our inside is actually more valuable and important than our outside. Or maybe that our kids' character and faith is more important than GPA or MVP. Or maybe that God is more important than anything. This man had a great farm. He was good at what he did. He was a good farmer. He had a bumper crop. I hope he enjoyed that. I got to tell you, that's quite an accomplishment. When a farmer has a crop like this man did, that's an accomplishment. I mean, there's so many variables that a farmer has to deal with that are out of his control. And so to have a year like this is an amazing accomplishment. But the question is, when he died, what did it gain for him? The issue is, do you know God? He clearly did not. We'd all do well to have a conversation with our soul about that. You have a degree, you have a bachelor's, a master's, a PhD. That's terrific. Because I got to tell you, you got to work hard. You have to work hard for those things. But the bottom line is, do you know God? You got the latest phone that has come out, and it's in your pocket. Or you got a 70-inch flat screen on the wall of your house. That's wonderful. But the question is, do you know God? Maybe you've seen the latest blockbuster, or you got tickets to the best concert. You've downloaded the latest songs on your phone. That's wonderful. But do you know God? Maybe you bought a new car. Maybe you paid off your mortgage. Maybe you have great health, great friends, a great future. Maybe you won your bracket in March Madness. That's terrific. But the issue is, do you know God? Could it be, ladies and gentlemen, that sometimes all of us are a little bit like this man? I think we read this story and we think, I'm not like that guy at all. But sometimes could it be that maybe we are a little bit, that we survey the landscape of our life and kind of feel like we got the world by the tail, that everything's in our control? Until one day we realize that it's not. We need to remind ourselves that life is more than possessions. Now, when we do that, we also need to remind ourselves that everybody possesses a soul. The one thing that we do possess that really is imperative is a soul. And so whether you realize it or not, you have a soul. Whether you want one or not, you have a soul. And your soul is that part of you that distinguishes you from the animal kingdom. You are not simply an evolved animal. In fact, the Bible says at the very beginning of the Bible that God made mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them male and female. He created them. We have been made in the very image of God. God has impressed something within us that is like him. It's an amazing thing. Your soul has been made in the image of God. And you and your soul are so intertwined that you can't separate them. You can't separate who you are, you, from your soul. You can't get up in the morning and leave your soul at home when you go to work or go to school. Your behavior affects your soul. And your soul, if it's properly educated and right with God, should affect your behavior. And it's your soul that will live on after your body dies. See, that's the important part of this story. Tonight your soul will be required of you, Jesus said. And so even though the man was going to die, his soul would continue to live. When that happens, of course, there's no going back. We don't get a do-over. We don't get a mulligan. We don't get a second chance. And so Solomon would say this: whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all of your might. For in the realm of the dead, where you are going, where I'm going, where we're all going, there is neither working, nor planning, nor knowledge, nor wisdom. Now, what that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that we got to pay attention to our soul now. And we got to make sure that we live a productive life. You know, I think, again, sometimes we read that story and think, well, I'm not like that man. Well, I think in many ways we are like that man. For one thing, we're busy. I got to tell you, there are a lot of you I may not know this morning, but I tell you what I do know. I know you live a busy life. We all do. I mean, that's just kind of the way our world is geared right now. We live a busy life. I've got a really good preacher friend that I love a great deal, and I think he loves me a great deal. And about a year and a half, 2 years ago, he was kind of concerned about my life, and he was concerned about the busyness of my life, and he sent me a book, and he said, I think you would do well to read this book, and it's entitled Little House on the Freeway, Help for the Hurried Home. Now, I'm sure it's a good book. I haven't had time to read it yet, but but that's the kind of life we live. But this story reminds us that we all need to take some time to recharge our batteries and to realign our priorities and to renew our connection with our families and to remember what is most important, and that is that we have a soul that's made in the image of God. But the third step in that is also to remember that every soul is accountable to God. Now again, that's whether we want it to be or not. You don't get to opt out of accountability to God. In fact, Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 12:7 that the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. Our ultimate accountability is to God. There's a passage in the New Testament in 2 Corinthians 5:10 that simply says that all of us should give an account of ourselves to God. And that's certainly true. That when we die, the soul continues to live, and the soul ultimately is accountable to God. There's a fascinating question in the heart of that story that we read to you in Luke chapter 12. It's in verse 20. When God says, now, who will own what you have prepared? That's a good question, isn't it? Here was a man that was absolutely consumed with getting things in this life. Jesus said a man's life doesn't consist in the abundance of things that he happens to possess. We possess a lot. We're Americans. We enjoy a pretty good life, and we ought to thank God for that. Again, Ecclesiastes 11 verse 7 and 14, in the day of prosperity rejoice. But what we do need about that is some perspective. Who will own what you have prepared? That job you do, I got to tell you, as soon as you either retire or die, somebody else is going to step in and do that job. The car you drive, I mean, after you die, somebody else is going to drive that vehicle. The clothes you wear are probably, when you die, going to be given away, either to somebody else or to charity. And the possessions that you have, you know what's going to happen? They're going to be scattered among your family. And what the family doesn't want, they'll never tell you this before you die, but what they don't want, they're going to sell on eBay. And then, beyond that, what doesn't sell, it's going to get put on the side of the street for the trash to pick up. And so God just says, look, prosper and enjoy, work hard, but you need to keep all of that in perspective. Job put it this way, you know what? We didn't bring anything in this world, and we're not going to take anything out. We came with nothing, we will leave with nothing. But the one thing, the one single thing that you will leave this world with is your soul. And so it will matter, as Jesus said, as to whether or not we are all rich toward God. So let's end with this morning. I want to ask you in conclusion this morning 2 questions. 2 very simple questions, and then the lesson's yours. Here they are. Question number 1, what will happen if this night your soul is required of you? That's a possibility. This man was not expecting that would be his last day in the world and that he would be accountable to God that night. So let me ask you, what would happen if this night your soul is required of you? Well, that would mean a lot of things different for different people. That would mean that some of you have been working hard, you wouldn't graduate. It would mean that some of you would not get married, who are engaged to be married. It would mean for some that you would not get to retire after all these years of work. It would mean for some that there are projects that you would not be able to finish, books you would not finish reading. It would mean there were goals that you were pursuing that you would not achieve. And so it'd be different for everybody. If this night your soul were required of you, you know what would happen? Your family would be very, very sad. And your friends would miss you. But if this night your soul is required of you, the most important thing is, what would God say about you? Because when all is said and done, the Bible says God's going to say one of two things. So in this story, he looked at a man and he said, "You fool. You've lived like a practical atheist. You haven't even let me enter your heart or your life." But the other thing God says that he can say is, "Well done," Matthew 25. "Well done. You are a good, faithful servant." And so what would God say about you if this night your soul were to be required of you? Have you been putting off some things that you really need to tend to, always going to take care of them in the future? Do you have some hidden part of your life that really needs to come to the surface and be brought into light and you need to come clean about and make right with God? Is there somebody that you need to forgive that you haven't forgiven? If your soul were required of you tonight, what would the Lord think about you? Because remember in this story, this man didn't think about God, but God had been thinking about him, just like he thinks about us. Here's the other question. What would happen if this night your soul is required of you? Now here's the second question. What will happen if this night your soul isn't required of you? So here's the other side of the story. What will happen if this night your soul is not required of you? And you know what? That's probably going to be the case. I mean, all things being equal, probably nobody who's in this room this morning is going to die tonight. Now, I don't know that, but I got to tell you, I think there are people in this audience that if the world continues on, they'll live another 60 years or more. But it's also true that we may not live 60 more minutes. We just really don't know about those kinds of things. What matters, whether you live another 60 years or you live another 60 minutes, what matters is that we not make the same mistake as the man in Jesus' story. And so if you take that story and you just distill it down and extract what really matters out of it, I think God would encourage us to enjoy the good life that he's given us, but to also make sure that we are rich toward God. Because we all need God, again, whether you realize that or not. And I think you probably do, or you wouldn't be here today. We all need God. We need him in our plans and in our homes, and most importantly, we need him in our hearts. We need to talk to God today. We need to remember God today. We need to thank God today. We need to walk with God today, because we might not have a tomorrow. And so it's good to have a conversation with our soul from time to time. But you know what we need to do even more than that? Even more than having a conversation with our soul, what we need to do is have a conversation with God. And I tell you what we need to say to God. There are two prophets in the Old Testament, and both of them had a very short conversation with God, but they're exactly what all of us need to say. One of them said this, "Speak, Lord, your servant hears." In other words, God, you just tell me what you want me to do, because I'm listening. And the other prophet said, "Command me, and I will obey." Speak, Lord, your servant hears. Command me, and I will obey. What great sentiment that is. You know, probably all of us are in a little different place in this audience this morning. Some of us have been Christians for a long, long time. For me, it's 47 years. I've been a Christian a long time. But there are probably people in this audience this morning who are here, and maybe all of this is just completely brand new to you. Maybe this is kind of your introduction to religion and faith and the Bible, and maybe even to God. Well, we want to thank you for being here. And I tell you what we'd love to do. We'd love to study the Bible with you some more. If you come out the back this morning and you see me, and just tell me you'd like to study the Bible, we'd love to do that with you. But maybe you're many steps on down the road from that. Maybe you've been studying the Bible for a long time and discerning what God wants you to do. And maybe you're at a point now where you understand that for you, the next step is to be buried in baptism so you can rise to walk in a new way of life. Now again, maybe that concept of baptism is kind of new to you. We'd love to explain that to you and talk with you about that and study with you about that. But it may be that you're here this morning and that's where you are today. And you know that that's the beginning that you need to make. If that's you today, we'd like to help you with that. If there's some response you need to make to God in a public way and we can help, we'd like to help you with that also. And so, if we can help you in a public way this morning, we hope you'll let us. Let's stand. Let's sing.